Welcome to Truth Watchers. I am Heath Henning. Today we are going to look at some of the evidence for the historicity of the life of Jesus, his crucifixion, and the resurrection. There is a lot of evidence that can be discussed, and I'm not going to be able to cover it all today, but what I have compiled, I believe, is more than enough to establish firmly the foundation of our faith in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. First, we will quote Tacitus, who was proconsul in Asia AD 112 through 113, and likely had access to the Roman archives to write his history. Tacitus is considered by modern scholars as our most reliable ancient source. This epistle was likely published in AD 116. It states, quote, "But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiation of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." Unquote. This comment confirms what Tertullian later expressed in his Apology, chapter 5, that Nero was the first to institute imperial persecution on Christians. Tacitus further confirms Jesus Christ was a historical figure, not some myth or legend that developed over a long period of time. Tacitus sets Christ properly in the chronological time frame that Luke does, that is, when Tiberius was Caesar and Pontius Pilate was procurator in Judea. The statement that Christ suffered the extreme penalty is obviously intended to identify the crucifixion, and he notes that Christian movement was checked momentarily but broke out again and quickly spread to Rome. This is an allusion to Pilate crucifying Christ to stop his popularity and his growing movement, but his followers shortly after began to proclaim his resurrection. In the 2nd century, Tertullian, a Christian author from Carthage, who was well educated and acquainted with Roman law prior to his conversion, wrote, quote, "Tiberius, accordingly, in whose day the Christian name made its entry into the world, having himself received intelligence from Palestine of events which had clearly shown the truth of Christ's divinity, brought the matter before the Senate with his own decision in favor of Christ. The Senate, because it had not given the approval itself, rejected his proposal. Caesar held to his opinion, threatening wrath against all accusers of the Christians." Unquote. Elsewhere, Tertullian wrote, quote, "All these things Pilate did to Christ, and now, in fact, a Christian in his own convictions, he sent word of him to the reigning Caesar, who was at that time Tiberius. Yes, and the Caesar too would have believed on Christ if either the Caesar had not been necessary for the world, or if Christians could have been Caesars." Unquote. This work was composed during the reign of Septimius, who reigned AD 197 to 200, and was directed to him. It indicates again Christ was a contemporary with Tiberius, whom, being Caesar at the time, received a report from Pilate that revealed Christ was divine. Tertullian claims that Tiberius advocated to have Christ added to the Roman pantheon, but the Senate opposed the notion. However, Tiberius' advocacy for the divinity of Christ is why there was no imperial persecution in the early stages of Christianity spreading across the Roman Empire, until Nero, that is. Whether or not all this is accurate history, we cannot prove, but the fact that Tertullian directed this to the emperor of the time would give some credibility to the claim, since they would have access to the archives to confirm or refute such claims. What I want to point out here is that there was allegedly communication between Pilate to Caesar about Christ. At an earlier date, Justin Martyr, writing to the Emperor Titus, Aelius, Hadrianus, Antonius Augustus Pius, who reigned AD 138 to 161, and this book was also directed to the Senate, made similar expressions alluding to such archives. Justin Martyr wrote, quote, "And that these things," referring to details of the crucifixion, "did happen, you can ascertain from the Acts of Pontius Pilate," unquote. He also said, "And that he did those things," referring in context to healing diseases and raising the dead, "you can learn from the Acts of Pontius Pilate," unquote. What Justin seems to be alluding to is validated in the appeals to these Acts of Pontius Pilate as something that the current reigning Caesar and the Senate could check and confirm. Whatever this text was, it apparently confirmed Christ was crucified and performed healings, which in context Justin argued were fulfilled prophecies from the Old Testament. So we find early evidence from Christians appealing to some sort of archives that the Roman government could confirm. And Tacitus, who likely had access to such archives to write his history, confirms these main premises. This sets Christ within historical fact as contemporary with Tiberius and Pilate, having performed miracles, dying by crucifixion, and after his death, by the cross, a religious movement following his teaching arose and spread from Judea to Rome. This essentially confirms the Gospels and the book of Acts as historically accurate. This is also remarkable when understanding the historical purpose of crucifixion. Martin Hengel wrote, quote, "Even Paul's Greek audience could hardly have approved of the logos to staru, much less the Jews who could see the Roman crosses erected in Palestine, especially when they could hardly forget the saying about the curse laid upon anyone hanged on a tree, Deuteronomy 21:23. A crucified Messiah, Son of God or God, must have seemed a contradiction in terms to anyone, Jew, Greek, Roman, or barbarian, asked to believe such a claim, and it will certainly have been thought offensive and foolish," unquote. Crucifixion was a form of punishment for the lowest of criminals and slaves. The idea of a crucified God was offensive and diametrically opposite of what someone inventing a religion would have proposed as an appealing concept to the ancient culture. God, or in the pagan concept of polytheism, gods, were to be exalted, not debased by the lowest means imaginable, causing death of such an exalted being deserved worship. There is absolutely no way this religion could have been invented if not grounded in historical truth, nor is there any way it would have been accepted across the empire without something that substantiated it, both historically by eyewitness testimonies and pragmatically, which would give credibility to the miracles of Christ and the apostles on their missionary journey. Julius Africanus, who lived AD 160 to 240, quoted from a pagan author named Thales, who is believed to have written his work around AD 55. Julius Africanus says, quote, "This darkness Thales, in the third book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. For the Hebrews celebrate the Passover on the 14th day according to the moon, and the passion of our Savior falls on the day before the Passover. But an eclipse of the sun takes place only when the moon comes under the sun, and it cannot happen at any other time but in the intervals between the first day of the new moon and the last of the old, that is, at their junction. How then should an eclipse be supposed to happen when the moon is almost diametrically opposite the sun? Let the opinion pass, however, let it carry the majority with it, and let this portent of the world be deemed an eclipse of the sun, like others a portent only to the eye," unquote. He also quoted another pagan author named Phlegon, who is believed to have written around AD 140. Quote, Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th, manifestly that one of which we speak, unquote. Origen also referred to Phlegon on a few occasions. First, he wrote, quote, and with regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appeared to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place, Phlegon too, I think, has written in the 13th or 14th book of his Chronicles, unquote. And later he stated, quote, now Phlegon, in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, although falling into confusion about some things which refer to Peter, as if they referred to Jesus, but also testifying that the result corresponded to his predictions, so that he also, by these very admissions regarding foreknowledge, as if against his will, expressed his opinion that the doctrine taught by the fathers of our systems were not devoid of divine power, unquote. These references to two separate pagan authors confirms there was a darkness over the earth during the crucifixion of Christ, as Matthew 27:45, Mark 15:33, and Luke 23:44 record. Furthermore, these pagan authors identified this supposed solar eclipse during a time of the month when it is physically impossible, as Julius Africanus argued. Though we cannot prove miracles on a historical level, this comes about the best evidence to provide various testimonies of something that should be physically impossible actually happened, being attested by early documents in the Synoptic Gospels and confirmed by hostile witnesses, one being as early as AD 55. E.P. Sanders, by no means a conservative Christian scholar, writes about Jesus Christ saying, quote, I think it strongly probable that Jesus was regarded as an exorcist. I continue to regard prophet as the best category. Jesus was also, however, an exorcist. I think we may be fairly certain that initially Jesus' fame came as a result of healing, especially exorcism. This is an important corrective to the common view that Jesus was essentially a teacher. He was also, and for some people primarily, a miracle worker, unquote. Indeed, the historical evidence strongly supports the miraculous events revolved around the life, ministry, and death of Jesus. These miracles are exactly why his followers recognized him as God. For a historian to make comments like strongly probable or fairly certain are very strong concepts or terms to use on a historical level. The earliest expression of Christian worship outside Christian sources is from Emperor Trajan's reign in AD 98 through 117. In a letter published in AD 112, Pliny the Younger, writing to Emperor Trajan, asked advice on how to treat the Christians he has arrested. He is noting the information he got from interrogating Christians, stating, quote, they affirmed, however, the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not do any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate, and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of the ordinary and innocent kind, unquote. This interesting comment refers to the early Christians singing to Christ as God, and the comment about food being ordinary and innocent is due to the fact that the pagans used to accuse Christians in those early centuries of cannibalism. This obviously was what they argued against, saying it was specifically just normal bread and normal grape juice. This is a strong rebuttal against transubstantiationism, which Catholicism. Robert E. Van Voorst, commenting on this passage of Pliny the Younger, said, quote, Christ here is a divine leader of this religion, worshipped by Christians, so that cursing him is tantamount to rejecting Christianity, unquote. This also fits among the many hymns we find in the New Testament that describe worship to Christ as God, of which Philippians 2, 6 through 11 is predominantly expressive. Other passages such as 1 Timothy 3:16 and Colossians 1:15 through 20 are believed to be hymns incorporated in Paul's epistles and many others. All this confirms an extremely early belief in the central claims of the gospel message, which could never allow legends or myths to have developed over time as skeptics would assert. Suetonius, another historian with access to imperial archives, wrote around AD 120, quote, because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbance at the instigation of Christus, he expelled them from the city, unquote. The odd spelling has stirred debate on whether the name Christus is supposed to be referring to Christ or not. Craig Keener explains, quote, the Greek term Christos, made for an unusual name in Greek, meaning something like anointed in medicine or plastered in construction language. Greeks did, however, make good use of similar sounding Christos, useful, especially as a slave name. Gentiles unfamiliar with Jewish terminology might then hear Christus as Christus, confusing Suetonius's source, unquote. Early Christians also noted that this pronunciation was common in the early centuries among the Romans. Tertullian stated, quote, but Christians, so far as the meaning of the word is concerned, is derived from anointing. Yes, as even when it is wrongly pronounced by you, Christianus, for you do not even know accurately the name you hate, it comes from sweetness or benignity, unquote. This wordplay was also used in Justin Martyr's First Apology, chapter 4, and Lactantius' Divine Institute 4:7. This passage from Suetonius confirms Claudius' expulsion of Jews from Rome, which occurred in AD 49. This is also mentioned in Acts 18:2, which states, quote, and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born of Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them, unquote. Notably, the Christian faith had reached Rome and caused an uproar among the Jews in the 40s, a mere decade after its origin in Israel. According to Josephus, Herod Agrippa reigned 3 years under Claudius Caesar, which would be the years AD 41 through 43. Herod Agrippa beheaded James and imprisoned Peter, who escaped, as recorded in Acts 12, 1 through 18. Acts 12:17 states of Peter, he departed and went into another place. A number of scholars, including Jack Feingen, Andrew Steinman, and Jonathan Bernier, based on this reference, proposed Peter went to Rome AD 42 to 43. Irenaeus identified in the 2nd century that Matthew wrote his Gospels, quote, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome, unquote. Of course, Paul was not preaching in Rome in the 40s, but it is reasonable to conclude that Matthew's Gospel was composed before AD 43, while Peter was in Rome. The Church Fathers, Papias, Fragment 6, Irenaeus Against Heresy, Book 3, Chapter 1, Section 1, Origen, Commentary on John 1:6 and 6:17, Eusebius, Church History, Book 5, Chapter 10, Section 3, all unanimously express Matthew was the first published gospel, having been written originally in Hebrew to the Jewish nation. This would be consistent with Paul, who said the gospel is to the Jews first and also to the Greek in Romans 1:16. Manuscript fragments of Matthew, known as the Magdalene Papyrus, is related to the Barcelona Papyrus, both having been dated to AD 62 to 66. The Magdalene Papyrus was discovered in Egypt, so it has to be considered that the original autograph of Matthew was written in Israel and copies were made, one copy eventually finding its way into Egypt. Obviously, the original autograph of Matthew was written some time before this manuscript is dated. Dead Sea Scrolls have also yielded debated Greek fragments identified as Mark 6:52 through 53, which is considered 7Q5 of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and 1 Timothy 3:16 through 4:3, identified as 7Q4. This demands a date for Matthew, Mark, and 1 Timothy before AD 66. The scholars that have rejected this historical evidence and manuscripts do so because of liberal education which blind them to preconceived opinions. Carsten Peter Thiede and Matthew D. Ancona, writing about the manuscript evidence for an early date of Matthew and the fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, expressed, quote, "Many theologians continue to be scandalized by the straightforward suggestion that their ancient sources are earlier and reasonably reliable. They prefer the notion that the Gospels are late community creations, legendary texts which may be freely interpreted by theories in our own time. Posturing as historians, many theologians employ methods that are often very different from those of the open-minded historical researchers." Unquote. Matthew was cited by the Church Fathers more frequently than Mark. The scripture index of the Ante-Nicene Fathers shows 25 and a half columns of references from Matthew being quoted by the Church Fathers of the first 3 centuries, compared to a mere 3.5 columns for Mark. We would expect Mark, being a shorter gospel, would be easier to memorize and copies more accessible and widespread, being easier to write. However, ancient rhetoric emphasizes the argument from antiquity, which would explain Matthew's preeminence in the early church. Internal, historical, archaeological, and manuscript evidence all support early dates for Matthew's composition. The claim Mark is the first written gospel assumes that since it is shorter, legends grew over time about Christ and were adapted in a larger gospel such as Matthew and Luke. However, historical sources such as 2 Maccabees, chapter 2, verses 23 through 32, refutes the theory of Mark's priority, informing us that the purpose of 2 Maccabees was to abridge a 5-volume text into one volume to make it easier for memorization. Hence, the longer version came first, and a shorter abridgment came after to make memorization easier. Matthew, being the first written gospel, is significant as it describes the life of a historical person, written within a decade of the events described, to the Jewish nation where the events took place, and within the lifetime of contemporary eyewitnesses, both friendly allies and hostile opponents. Matthew is also significant because its detailed resurrection account. Paul's earliest epistle, written in AD 50 to 52, frequently mentions the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ in 1 Thessalonians 1:10, 4:14, and chapter 5, verses 9 through 10. Paul's conversion has been dated at AD 36 by Andrew Steinman and others. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 6 uses the term received and delivered, which are common rabbinic idioms for passing on oral traditions as taught and memorized, often word for word. No matter when one dates the Gospels, this creed is believed to have been formulated 3 to 8 years after the crucifixion. Dean Overman stated, quote, "The consensus of scholarship is that Paul received this tradition from the original congregation in Jerusalem at the time of his visit to that city a few years after his conversion." Unquote. Many un-Pauline phrases in this passage indicate this was a memorized creed, such as according to the scriptures in verses 3 and 4 of 1 Corinthians 15, third day in verse 4, the 12 in verse 5. The use of Aramaic name, such as Cephas instead of Peter, points to the creed's origin in Jerusalem. This proves the gospel was preached to contemporaries in Israel immediately after Christ's death. Josephus' famous passage known as the Testimonium is important to quote. He wrote in Antiquity of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 3, Paragraph 3, quote, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." Unquote. Some of the debated phrases from Josephus need to be discussed briefly here. He writes, quote, "If it be lawful to call him a man," unquote, it assumes this implies divinity. Of course, Josephus was a Jew, so many contest that Josephus would not have referred to Christ as a divine man. Josephus, however, applied deified language to prophets in Antiquities, Book 3, Section 180, and Book 10, Section 35, and Book 18, Section 64. Furthermore, Josephus recognized false prophets to accurately prophesy in Antiquities, Book 18, Section 195 through 204, and you can compare that with Book 18, Section 236 through 237. Such terminology from Josephus neither implied true divinity nor the prophetic spirit from Jehovah. The term, quote, "doer of wonderful works," unquote, does indicate Christ performed miracles. Many would contest that Josephus would not have accepted Jesus performing miracles. However, all the ancient Jewish sources recognize Christ and Christians performed miracles, though they considered them sorcery. And you could see the list of various Jewish texts, the Tosefta, Ecclesiastes, Rabbah, the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmud, and Toledoth Yeshu. The phrase, quote, "he was the Christ," unquote, is often rejected because it says he was the Christ. A Jew wouldn't have said that, it is claimed. This is a clarifying ambiguity of someone with the common name Jesus. Elsewhere, Josephus wrote in Antiquities, Book 20, Section 200, quote, "the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James," unquote. Identifying Jesus as Christ to his Roman audience is no different from calling him the Nazarene or son of Joseph, though none of those expressions would have clarified which Jesus was being discussed better than the Christ, which the Romans knew of from the Christians. It has also been suggested Josephus wouldn't admit Christ's death was at the suggestion of the principal men among us, which clearly says the Jews conspired to kill Christ. However, other ancient Jewish sources admit they conspired to kill Christ, including the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 43a, and Toledoth Yeshu. Finally, the phrase that Christ, quote, "appeared to them alive again the third day," unquote, is doubted. This whole passage should be understood as derogatory rhetoric based on parallels Josephus makes in the surrounding context, especially in Antiquities, Book 18, Section 65 through 80, or if you got the older versions, it's the very next paragraph, paragraph 4 of chapter 3. Where a woman is beguiled by a man she's supposed to be the god Anubis. His deception was exposed on the third day after, ending with priests of Isis being crucified. In the context, and in Josephus' rhetorical style, it is likely he intends to accuse the Christian religion as a movement that arose from deception. However, in his attack against Christianity, he has affirmed all the central elements of the faith and that they have been well established and known even by enemies in the first century. Christianity is well based on an early historical figure without enough time to develop from legends or myths. Jewish scholar Geza Vermesh wrote of this passage from Josephus, quote, "It is also noteworthy that in the testimonium of Josephus, Jesus is portrayed as a wise man and a performer of marvelous deeds. Both epithets, and especially the later, fit so well into the historical context that their invention or interpolation into the account by a later Christian forger is unlikely. Indeed, even a somewhat critical early rabbinic mention distinguishes not only Jesus himself, but his disciples as well by their miraculous healing activities." Unquote. In his book, he footnotes the reference that I had to the Tosefta in the earlier slide. One of the Jewish sources admitting Christ performed miracles and the Jews conspiring to kill him is the Babylonian Talmud. It states, quote, "It was taught on the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, 'He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf.' But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover." Ulla reported, "Do you suppose that he was one from whom a defense could be made? Was not he a miseth, enticer, concerning whom Scripture says, 'Neither shalt thou spare, neither shalt thou conceal him'? With Yeshu, however, it was different, for he was connected with the government, or royalty." Unquote. This quote from the Babylonian Talmud indicates for 40 days they plotted his death. It claims he was guilty of sorcery, that is, performing miracles, and apostasy, that is, leading Jews away from their faith. It says he was killed on the eve of Passover. It also confirms Christ was a descendant of the Jewish kings. Mark Eastman, commenting about this passage from the Talmud, states, quote, "This is considered to be one of the very reliable rabbinic references to Jesus, Yeshu. The writer here verifies that Jesus of Nazareth was a historical figure, that he was crucified on the eve of Passover, and that he did miracles, referred to as sorcery. According to Jewish law, it is illegal to perform capital punishment on the eve of the Passover. However, this record verifies something that we wouldn't expect to find in a rabbinical source: the fact that the Sanhedrin acted illegally in condemning and crucifying Jesus on Passover. Consequently, this reference is seen more valuable in terms of validating the historicity of Jesus." Unquote. All these sources, and there are more I haven't discussed, strongly confirm the historical factor of the Christian faith: the early proclamation of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, hymns sung to him as God, miracles performed by him, as well as the miraculous darkness at the crucifixion. As Antony Flew, who was the greatest atheistic philosopher but became a deist before his death, said in an interview, quote, "The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity, I think, from the evidence offered for the occurrence of most other supposedly miraculous events." Unquote. Truly, there is no reasonable position to doubt the historicity of Christianity. This is Heath Henning. Thank you for tuning into Truth Watchers podcast. Remember to hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend. For more fascinating facts, check us out at truthwatchers.com, because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children, as is indicated in 3 John verse 4. "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth."